Alright, quick hello from me. This is an original story from Tales Fair, and honestly, I didn't see this one unfolding the way it did. Alright, let's get into it.
On my 35th birthday, my mother-in-law looked at my 8-year-old daughter and announced, "Don't be like Mommy. She's a liar." Then I got slapped across the face in front of 27 guests. I stood up, laughing. When they found out why, their faces drained of color. I know how that sounds. Like a headline that crawled out of the internet on its hands and knees. Like I'm about to sell you a weight loss tea and a manifestation journal. But I'm telling you this because the slap wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sentence that came before it. Because the slap hit my face. That sentence aimed for my daughter's brain. And once a kid learns to doubt her mother, you don't just move on. You either fix it, fast, or you spend years paying interest on someone else's cruelty. My name is Claire Harrington. Yes, that's my legal name. No, it's not the name I was born with. That's what happens when you marry into a family that treats names like branding. I'm an attorney. I'm 35. And I have an 8-year-old daughter named Sophie who is so polite she says, "Excuse me," to furniture. She's also the reason I didn't walk away quietly. Because when you have a child, you don't get to choose the easy version of courage. You get the necessary one. That morning, my birthday morning, our apartment was silent in the way expensive spaces are silent. Thick carpets, good windows. The kind of calm that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're not. Sophie sat at the kitchen island in her pajamas, shoulders tucked in, like she was trying to make herself smaller than her own body. I poured pancake batter. She didn't look at me. Not in the usual sleepy kid way, in the careful way. The what mood is mom in and what answer is safe way. That doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from training. "Mom?" Sophie said finally, tracing a slow circle on the marble with her finger. "Yeah, baby." Do I have to go tonight?" She didn't mean the restaurant. She meant Margaret, my mother-in-law. The woman who could say sweetheart like it was a warning. I kept my voice light. "It's my birthday dinner. We'll be there for a little while. Then we'll go home." Sophie nodded like she understood the words, but not the promise. Then she said the thing that made my stomach drop. "Grandma said you lie." Just like that. No drama. No tears. Just a flat sentence, like she was repeating a homework fact. I stopped moving. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I didn't want my face to teach Sophie that truth causes explosions. I turned off the burner, wiped my hands, and crouched so we were eye level. "Did Grandma say that?" I asked gently. Sophie nodded. "What exactly did she say?" Sophie's lips pressed together. She hesitated, like answering wrong could get her in trouble. Then she whispered. She said, "Don't be like Mommy. Mommy makes things up." "Did Grandpa say anything?" Sophie swallowed. He said, "Your mother tells stories." Stories. That's what they called my reality when it didn't match their narrative. It's such a clever word, isn't it? It sounds harmless. Like bedtime, like imagination, like you're not actively teaching a child that her mother can't be trusted. I took Sophie's hands. Her fingers were cold. "Soph, look at me." She looked up slowly, and I hated how prepared she looked for consequences. "I'm not perfect," I said. "Sometimes I get things wrong. Sometimes I forget things. But I don't lie to you. Ever." Her shoulders lowered a fraction, like she wanted to lean into that truth, but wasn't sure she was allowed. Then she whispered, "Grandma said if I believe you, I'm being disloyal." That word hit me harder than any slap. Disloyal. They weren't just insulting me, they were recruiting my child. Here's what you should understand about the Harringtons. They don't fight like normal families fight. They don't yell and slam doors and regret it later. They manage. They don't threaten. They imply. They don't punish you loudly. They punish you quietly, elegantly, in ways that make you look crazy if you complain. A raised eyebrow, a concerned text, a perfectly timed comment in front of the right person. They'll ruin your life with a smile and then send you flowers to prove they're not that kind of people. Margaret Harrington didn't need to scream to be terrifying. She did it with tone. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down like she was pricing me. Then she said, "Oh, Claire, you're charming." Charming is what rich people say when they don't mean impressive. Charming is what you call a thing you'd never take seriously. When I married Alex, Margaret made sure I understood the rules, not directly. She never said, "I'm in charge." She said things like, "We're a close family. Alexander needs stability. We value discretion." And then she'd smile like she'd just offered me tea instead of a warning. Alex would squeeze my hand under the table like he was reassuring me, and I'd squeeze back thinking, he's on my side. He chose me. I didn't know yet that Alex had been conditioned to choose his mother the way people choose breathing, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know he had another option. Alex wasn't cruel in a loud way. He didn't call me names. He didn't throw things. He did something more dangerous. He stayed neutral. He'd hear Margaret say something sharp to Sophie, something like, "We don't whine in this family," when my daughter's eyes were full of tears, and he'd just keep eating. He'd watch Sophie flinch at Margaret's touch and say nothing, and if I tried to step in, he'd murmur, "Claire, don't start." Don't start. Translation: don't make my mother uncomfortable. The first time I realized Margaret was working on Sophie, it wasn't dramatic. It was small. We were at Margaret's house for brunch, one of those properties where everything smells like lemon and money. Sophie dropped a fork. The fork hit the floor with a tiny clink. Sophie froze like she'd dropped a grenade. Margaret didn't even look down. She looked at Sophie and said softly, "Clumsy. Not oops. Not it's okay. Clumsy. Like it was a personality defect." Sophie's face went red. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Margaret sipped her coffee. "Don't apologize. Fix yourself." And then she glanced at me with a smile. "Children model what they see," she said, meaning, this is your fault. After that, little things started showing up like cracks in glass. Sophie stopped running into my arms when I picked her up from school. She walked, carefully, like she was trying not to appear too excited. She started asking permission before laughing. At bedtime, she'd tell me stories about Grandma's rules. Grandma says good girls don't ask questions. Grandma says crying is manipulative. Grandma says if I say something Mommy said, I have to check if it's true first. Check if it's true first. She was 8. They were making her fact-check her own mother like I was a rumor. One night, Sophie whispered, "Grandma says you get confused." I held her close. "Did Grandma say that?" Sophie nodded. "What did she mean?" Sophie's voice was tiny. "She said, sometimes you imagine things. Like, you think something happened, but it didn't." And there it was. Not just alienation. Gaslighting. Installed in a child. And if you've never seen that up close, let me tell you, it's chilling. Because kids believe adults. Kids believe confidence. Kids believe the person who speaks like the rules are already written. Margaret spoke like she had a pen in her hand and the authority to rewrite reality. I tried, at first, to handle it like a normal person. I talked to Alex. I said, "Your mother is undermining me with our child." Alex sighed like I'd complained about the weather. "Claire," he said, "she's old school. She's not undermining you. She's trying to help Sophie." Help. That was always the word. Margaret didn't control. She helped. Margaret didn't manipulate. She guided. Margaret didn't hurt. She corrected. And if you dared to call it what it was, you were emotional. You were unstable. You were making things up. Then came Dr. Paul Kessler. Kessler entered our lives like a solution. Margaret framed him as a gift. He's exceptional, she told Alex. He's discreet. He understands families like ours. Families like ours. As if wealth was a mental illness with a support group. Kessler wasn't warm. He didn't ask, "How are you feeling?" He asked, "Are you compliant?" Okay, not in those words. He dressed it up. He called it alignment. He called it family coherence. He called it reducing friction. But what he really did was teach Alex to interpret any disagreement from me as a threat. If I set a boundary, I was provoking instability. If I defended Sophie, I was creating conflict. If I asked why Margaret was allowed to say things to our daughter that would get a teacher fired, I was undermining authority. Authority. That was Margaret again. Always Margaret. The sessions were always in Margaret's home office, always with Margaret present, always with Alex sitting closest to her. Kessler would look at me like I was a case file and say things like, "Claire, tell us why you struggle with control." I'd blink and say, "Excuse me?" He'd smile slightly. "You prefer your version of reality." My version. As if there were two equal sides. As if Margaret's lies were simply her perspective. Kessler didn't ask Sophie how she felt. He asked Sophie who she felt safe with, and Margaret would watch, eyes bright, waiting for the right answer. The first time Sophie answered, "Mommy," Margaret's smile didn't move, but her hand tightened around her teacup. Then Margaret said gently, "Sophie, sweetheart, remember, Mommy gets overwhelmed." And Sophie's brow furrowed. Then Sophie said, "I feel safe with Grandma too." Margaret's eyes softened like she'd just won something, and I realized this wasn't therapy. This was a custody rehearsal. That's when I stopped trying to win inside their system, because you cannot win a game where the other side owns the referee. So I started doing what lawyers do when they don't have the luxury of being naive. I documented. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I didn't beg Alex to see it. I built a file. There's a shelf in my closet behind handbags I never liked. If you pull the third bag and press the back panel, the shelf lifts. Inside is a small fireproof safe. Inside the safe were thumb drives, printed records, and a folder labeled Harrington C. Kessler, custody, not revenge, not destroy them. Just custody. Because that was the battlefield Margaret was walking us toward, whether I wanted it or not. I saved every text Margaret sent that looked innocent but wasn't. Just checking in, Sophie seemed unusually clingy after being with you. I'm worried about Sophie's exposure to emotional volatility. Have you considered that your career may be impacting your ability to parent consistently? Consistently. That's another rich people word. It means you don't get to have a life unless it fits our aesthetic. I saved every email from Kessler. Invoices with strange phrasing. Notes that sounded like someone writing a narrative, not documenting health. I saved calendar invites titled Family Session that were really training sessions for Alex. I saved the one text from Alex that broke my heart. Mom says it would be better if Sophie spends more time at her place. She needs structure. Structure. Sophie needed safety, and if Alex couldn't tell the difference, that wasn't just a marriage problem. That was a parenting emergency. I hired Ryan quietly. Ryan wasn't dramatic. He didn't wear a trench coat. He didn't call himself an investigator like it was a movie title. He wore plain clothes and listened more than he spoke. He was also the first person who said something that made me feel sane again. After I told him everything, Margaret, Kessler, Sophie's new fear, Ryan nodded slowly and said, This is classic alienation. And the money stuff? That's just the engine. The control is the point. The control is the point. Exactly. Ryan did what I couldn't do alone. He found patterns. He followed the paper. He connected names and LLCS and transfers. He found the quiet machinery behind the Harrington image. Because the Harringtons weren't just wealthy. They were connected. Donors. Board members. People whose phones got answered. People who believed consequences were for other families. And when people like that commit crimes, they don't do it like amateurs. They do it with spreadsheets. I'm not going to pretend I understood everything at first. I understood family law. I understood courtroom strategy. But the money was a maze. Ryan laid it out for me one night at my kitchen table while Sophie slept down the hall. He slid a folder across the marble. Here, he said. Look at this. Transfers, dates, amounts. He tapped one line. This isn't normal business. This is routing. I stared. Where is it going? Ryan exhaled. Places people go when they don't want anyone to see where the money went. And suddenly, Margaret's polished life looked less like legacy and more like a crime scene with good lighting. The scariest part wasn't the money. It was realizing Margaret wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was trying to erase me. She was building a story where Claire Harrington was unstable, dishonest, emotionally volatile, and therefore not a reliable parent. If she could get that story into the right hands, she could take Sophie away without ever raising her voice. And if you think that sounds dramatic, you've never watched a wealthy family weaponize concern. Because in a family like the Harringtons, concern is a knife you're expected to thank them for. That's when I did the other thing Margaret never expected. I walked the evidence outside of her world, quietly, to people who didn't care about Harrington parties, people who cared about Harrington paper trails. I didn't walk into an office screaming, "My mother-in-law is evil." I walked in with a binder. I walked in with timelines. I walked in with documented patterns. And when you put facts in front of the right people, they don't roll their eyes. They take notes. By the time my birthday dinner arrived, there were already conversations happening in offices downtown. Sealed doors, neutral voices, words like wire transfers, shell entities, money laundering, obstruction, and witness tampering. There was talk of the Southern District of New York. There was talk of warrants. There was talk of timing. And Margaret, who controlled everything, had no idea she was already late. So when Alex told me, "Dinner will be intimate," I smiled. In Harrington language, intimate means curated. It means every person was chosen for a reason. It means every seat has a purpose. It means the room itself is a weapon. I spent that day the way you spend a day when you know a storm is coming. I worked. I answered emails. I picked Sophie up from school. I listened to her chatter about a class project like my heart wasn't tight as a fist. At one point she asked, "Do you think Grandma will be nice tonight?" I said, "I think Grandma will be herself." Sophie nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. That's not something an 8-year-old should have to understand. When we got home, Sophie got dressed slowly. She chose socks twice, changed them, then changed them again. Small anxiety disguised as choices. Alex came in from the bedroom wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He didn't look at me when he adjusted his cufflinks. He looked at his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen like he was waiting for permission to breathe. I watched him and felt a strange grief, because I remembered the man he used to be. The man who laughed easily. The man who held Sophie like she was fragile and precious, not like she was a responsibility to be managed. Now he moved like a puppet who didn't know he had strings. On the ride over, Sophie sat between us in the back seat. Alex stared out the window, jaw tense. I watched the city blur past and tried to keep my breathing slow. Not because I was afraid of Margaret. Because I was afraid of what Sophie would see. Kids don't forget scenes like this. Kids store them in their bodies, and I was done letting my daughter's nervous system become collateral damage in Margaret's war. We arrived at a private dining room at Hudson Yards, high above Manhattan, where the windows made the city look like a toy set built for rich people. The staff smiled too brightly. The flowers were arranged too perfectly. The air smelled like citrus and quiet judgment. Sophie's hand was in mine, and her fingers were cold. Margaret greeted us at the entrance like she was accepting an award. "Claire," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "You look lovely." Translation: "You look acceptable." Then she crouched in front of Sophie and adjusted her dress. Not gently, possessively. "My beautiful girl," Margaret said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Say hello, properly." Sophie's mouth opened. No sound came out. Margaret's smile didn't move, but her fingers tightened on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie whispered, "Hi." Margaret patted her cheek. "Good." And then, without looking at me, she added, "See? She listens." I scanned the room the way lawyers scan juries. Faces, body language, allies, risks. 27 guests. I counted. Margaret liked numbers that felt intentional, like nothing in her life was accidental. 27 meant controlled, not random. It meant she'd decided exactly how many witnesses she wanted. There was a state senator, Whitaker, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny, the kind of man everyone still called senator anyway. A judge, Caldwell, drinking expensive wine like ethics rules were an optional accessory. A few Harrington executives with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A couple of family friends whose friendship looked suspiciously like shared secrets. And then, seated with a clear view of our table, like the evening had been built around his line of sight, Dr. Paul Kessler. Kessler lifted his glass at me, not as a greeting, as a challenge. Dinner began. Waiters moved like shadows. Plates arrived like art. People talked about investments and legacy and family values in the tone you use when you're trying to convince yourself you're a good person. Sophie picked at her food like she was afraid the plate might accuse her of something. Alex didn't touch mine or Sophie's plate. He drank water and watched Margaret. I knew that look. It was the look of a man waiting to be told what he was allowed to do next. At one point, Margaret leaned across the table and said to Sophie, "Sweetheart, tell Grandma what Mommy promised you." Sophie blinked. I don't... Margaret smiled. "Come on, you remember. Mommy said she'd take you somewhere, didn't she?" Sophie glanced at me, confused. I realized what Margaret was doing. She was planting a trap. If Sophie guessed wrong, Margaret could say, "See? Mommy confuses her." If Sophie guessed right, Margaret could say, "See? Mommy makes promises she can't keep." Either way, the conclusion was the same. Mommy is unreliable. Grandma is stable. I cut in calmly. "Sophie and I are going to the museum on Saturday." Margaret's smile held. "Oh," she said, as if she'd won something. "Saturday. How sweet." Then she turned to the guests. "Claire is very ambitious," Margaret said. "Sometimes ambition makes it hard to focus on what matters." She placed a hand over her heart like she was worried. The guests murmured politely. I thought, this is not a birthday dinner. This is a deposition with appetizers. Halfway through the meal, Margaret stood and tapped her glass. The room quieted instantly because rich people are trained to obey wealth the way dogs obey whistles. "My dear friends," she began, "thank you for celebrating Claire tonight." She looked at me. 35, she said, like it was a diagnosis. Polite laughter. Then Margaret's eyes slid to Sophie. "And this," she said warmly, is our little Sophie, 8 years old. The future. Sophie stiffened. Margaret extended her hand, palm up, like she was summoning a pet. Sophie, she said. Come here, sweetheart. Sophie looked at me. I nodded. Small. Encouraging. I'm here. I've got you. Sophie walked to Margaret, stopping just close enough to be in her reach. Margaret placed a hand on Sophie's back. Not supportive. Controlling. And then Margaret smiled at the room and said, Now, Sophie, you remember what we talked about. Tell everyone what Grandma told you. Sophie's face went pale. Grandma said, she started, voice shaking. Margaret squeezed her back, hard. Sophie flinched. Go on, Margaret said softly. Sophie's eyes flicked to me again. And Margaret delivered the line herself for maximum damage. She turned Sophie slightly toward me like a human prop and said, Don't be like Mommy. A few guests chuckled, uncertain. Margaret's smile widened. She's a liar. The room went still. Not shocked still. Interested still. Like they'd been waiting for the show to start. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My hands went numb. Sophie stood there frozen, like the floor was suddenly unsafe. I started to rise. Margaret! Margaret held up one manicured finger without looking at me, and everyone accepted it. Everyone let her silence me. Because when people like Margaret speak, people like this room listen. Alex's chair scraped. He stood. I knew that sound. I'd heard it late at night after Kessler sessions. I'd heard it after Margaret talks with him. It was the sound of Alex turning into the person Margaret needed him to be. He didn't look at Sophie. He didn't look at me like a husband. He looked at me like a problem. Claire, he said, loud enough for the room. Why don't you tell everyone the truth for once? My breath caught. He continued, voice tight, rehearsed. You've been lying. About money. About where you go. About what you tell Sophie. I stared at him. His eyes were glassy. Not drunk. Conditioned. Alex, I said quietly. Stop. Margaret's gaze never left me. Kessler leaned back, watching like this was his favorite episode. Alex's jaw clenched. And then he did exactly what Margaret wanted. He stepped forward, and he slapped me. It wasn't a dramatic movie slap. It was worse. A real one. The kind that makes your ears ring, and your skin burn, and your brain take a second to catch up. For a heartbeat, the room stayed perfectly silent. Then I heard Sophie gasp. A small sound. The sound of a child realizing adults can be dangerous. That sound, more than the sting on my face, almost broke me. Almost. I touched my cheek, looked at my fingers. No blood. Just heat. Just proof. 27 witnesses. 27 sets of eyes. 27 people who could no longer pretend they didn't know. And that's when I did the one thing Margaret didn't plan for. I laughed. Not hysterical. Not manic. Just amused. Like someone had finally handed me the last missing page of a file I'd been building for years. Margaret blinked. Alex froze, like he'd woken up mid-dream. Someone whispered, "What the?" I stood, slowly, calmly. I smoothed my dress like I was preparing for closing arguments, and I said, clear as a bell, "Thank you." Margaret's smile twitched. "For what?" she asked. I looked around the room. "At everyone," I said. "For showing up." Silence. I smiled. "You didn't just come to my birthday dinner," I said. "You came to testify." Alex swallowed. "Claire, sit down." I turned to him. "Oh, Alex," I said softly. "I'm done sitting." Then I looked at Sophie, still standing by Margaret, still frozen. And I did something that didn't look dramatic, but mattered more than anything else I did that night. I held out my hand. "Soph," I said gently, "come to Mommy." Margaret's fingers tightened again. Sophie hesitated. I kept my hand out. No pressure, no panic, just an open door. Sophie's eyes filled, and then she moved. She stepped away from Margaret like she was stepping away from a hot stove she'd been told was normal. She walked to me. I took her hand, and I felt her whole body shake. Margaret's face hardened. "Claire, you are not going to make a scene." I leaned in, voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm not making a scene," I whispered. "I'm ending one." Then, louder, for the room. "Ryan." From the side of the room, Ryan, my friend, my investigator, my quiet insurance policy, stood and nodded once. He approached like he belonged there, because he did. I crouched to Sophie. "Sweetheart," I said, "you're going to go with Ryan to Aunt Erin's, your dad's sister. Okay?" Sophie clutched my hand like a lifeline. "Are you coming?" she whispered. "In a minute," I promised. "I'm right behind you." Sophie looked at my cheek, looked at Alex. Then she nodded. Ryan guided her toward the door. Margaret took a step forward. I took a step too. Not aggressive, just positioned. Margaret stopped, because it's one thing to bully a woman alone. It's another thing to block her in front of 27 witnesses after your son just assaulted her. Even Margaret understood optics. When the door closed behind Sophie, I turned back to the table, and I let the lawyer part of me step forward, the part Margaret had spent years trying to shame into silence, the part that didn't cry. It documented. "Margaret," I said, "you were right." She lifted her chin. "Of course I was." I nodded. "I have been lying," I said. A ripple went through the guests. Margaret's eyes gleamed. Alex exhaled, like relief. Then I smiled again. "I've been lying," I continued, "about how much I knew." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small remote. The projector behind the room's art wall flickered. A few guests shifted, uncomfortable. A waiter glanced at Margaret like he wanted permission to exist. I didn't give him a chance to wait. I clicked. A slide appeared. Harrington Group. Flow of funds boxes. Arrows. LLCs with names so bland they sounded like fake people. Transfers with dates. Amounts with too many zeros. A neat little diagram of greed. Someone choked on their wine. Senator Whitaker's laughter died in his throat. Judge Caldwell's face turned the color of paper. Margaret stared, still, quiet, like she didn't believe reality had the audacity. "You can't," Margaret started. "Oh, I can," I said, cheerful. "And the best part? I don't have to convince you." I clicked again. A second slide. Communications, instructions, text message screenshots, email headers, meeting notes with Margaret's friendly tone and very unfriendly intent. Then a third. Dr. Paul Kessler. Billing. Notes. Kessler sat up sharply. "That is confidential," he snapped. I tilted my head. "Doctor," I said, "you bill like a consultant and write like a strategist. Don't insult the room by pretending this is therapy." A few guests shifted, because I'd just said the quiet part out loud. Kessler's jaw clenched. "You obtained those illegally." I smiled. "You're welcome to argue that in court." Then I looked at the room. "Also," I added, "for anyone wondering, I'm an attorney. I didn't build this case with vibes." Margaret's nostrils flared. "Claire," she said coldly, "you're embarrassing yourself." I clicked again. A fourth slide. custody strategy, narrative, and under it, audio. Margaret's voice filled the room, calm and cruel. If Sophie starts repeating what Claire says, correct it immediately. Tell her mommy makes things up. We need her to doubt Claire's memory. If Sophie believes Claire lies, family court becomes easier. You could feel every guest's spine stiffen. That wasn't old-school parenting. That was intent. That was a plan. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another guest muttered, "Is that real?" Kessler's face went tight. Margaret didn't move, but her eyes did. They flicked once, just once, to Senator Whitaker. Like, "Fix this." Whitaker stared at the screen, like, "Absolutely not." Judge Caldwell's glass paused halfway to his mouth. Because even people who live on the edge of ethics tend to hate being caught on camera near the cliff. I clicked again. Another audio clip. Margaret again. "We'll say Claire is unstable. We'll say she's alienating Sophie from Alexander. We'll say she's emotionally volatile." A pause. Then Kessler's voice, smooth as a knife. "If Alexander loses control, it helps. A public incident would support the narrative." The room didn't just go quiet. It went thin, like the oxygen had been pulled out. I touched my cheek again, smiled at Alex. "Oh, look," I said lightly. "We got our public incident." Alex's face drained. Not guilt. Not yet. Fear, because fear is what happens when someone realizes they've been used. Margaret tried to laugh. A little sound. Dry. "You're recording family conversations?" she said, like I was the monster. I shrugged. "My attorney advised me," I said, and then added sweetly, "Oh, wait, that's me." A few guests flinched, because sarcasm feels inappropriate, until you realize it's the only thing holding you upright. Margaret's voice sharpened. "You can't threaten people in my home." "Margaret," I said, "this isn't your home. This is a private dining room with staff and security cameras." Then I smiled at the room. "And before anyone gets any creative ideas," I added, "copies of everything you're seeing tonight are already out of my hands." Margaret's face tightened. "Who did you send them to?" she demanded. I paused, just long enough for it to sting. Then I said clearly, "The U.S. Attorney's Office." A ripple. "And the FBI." Now the ripple became a wave. Because wealthy people don't panic over morality, they panic over jurisdiction. A guest stood abruptly. "This is insane. I'm leaving." "Of course you are," I said pleasantly. "Just remember, leaving doesn't erase what you witnessed." Another guest reached for his phone. I lifted a hand. "Go ahead. Call your lawyer." "I already did." Margaret's voice turned sharp. "Claire, stop this, right now." I looked at her. Really looked. And beneath the polish, beneath the posture, I saw it. Not anger. Terror. Because Margaret didn't fear shame. She feared losing control. Kessler pushed his chair back. "You're destroying a family." I tilted my head. "No, doctor. I'm documenting what you helped build." He snapped. "This is a violation of privacy." I smiled. I love when people say privacy when they mean impunity. Then I clicked again. A final slide. Witness list. 27 present names. Not all of them, obviously, just enough for the message to land. I looked around the room. "Congratulations," I said. "You're all part of the record now." And that's when the door opened. Not softly, not politely. It swung with purpose. A man in a dark jacket stepped in, voice calm as a weather report. "NYPD and federal agents with a warrant." Behind him, more people entered. Badges, paperwork. Quiet authority. Rich rooms are used to attention. They are not used to this kind of attention. The man in front, Captain Donnelly, walked straight toward Margaret. "Margaret Harrington," he said. "We have warrants." Margaret lifted her chin like she could outstare the law. "This is harassment," she said. Donnelly didn't blink. "Ma'am, please stand." Kessler half stood, then thought better of it. An agent stepped toward him. "Dr. Kessler," the agent said, "we need you to come with us." Kessler's face twisted. "On what grounds?" The agent looked down at the paperwork. "Multiple," he said. "Start with obstruction." Kessler opened his mouth, closed it, sat down slowly like gravity had doubled. Senator Whitaker's hands were shaking. Judge Caldwell looked like he'd just remembered every ethics seminar he'd ever ignored. One executive started sweating through his collar. Another woman whispered, "I shouldn't have come." And I thought, yes, that's the point. Margaret turned toward Alex, eyes flashing. "Alexander!" she snapped. "Do something!" Alex looked at her, then at me, then at the agents. And for the first time all night, he looked like a man who wasn't sure who he belonged to. He swallowed. "Claire, what did you do?" I met his eyes. "I protected our daughter," I said. "That's what I did." His voice cracked. I didn't mean..." I held up a hand. "Alex," I said quietly, "you hit me in front of 27 witnesses." He flinched like I'd slapped him back with words. "I don't need you to explain it," I said. "I need you to understand it." Margaret began speaking rapidly, names, donors, connections, threats disguised as reminders. Donnelly listened like he was bored, because people like Margaret always think power is portable, like it can be carried in a handbag. It can't. Not when you walk into a room where everyone is immune to your charm. Agents began collecting phones, laptops, watches that weren't just watches. Margaret's face tightened as she realized the room wasn't hers anymore. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not joy. Relief. Because the cage door had finally made a sound. Later, hours later, I sat in Erin's guest room, holding a paper cup of tea I hadn't tasted. Erin, Alex's sister, stood by the doorway like a guard. Erin had always been polite in the way family members are polite when they're watching you for weakness, but tonight her eyes were soft. "Are you okay?" she asked. I touched my cheek. "It stings," I said. Erin's mouth tightened. "He hit you." "Yeah," I said. "He did." Erin swallowed. "Sophie?" I looked toward the bed. Sophie was asleep curled around a stuffed animal, cheeks tear-stained, breath steady. "She's here," I whispered. "She's safe." Erin nodded once, fierce. "Good." When Sophie woke in the middle of the night, she padded into the room and climbed into my lap without speaking. Her little arms locked around my waist. She didn't cry. She just held on like she was terrified I might evaporate. I kissed the top of her head. "You're safe," I murmured. After a long moment, Sophie whispered, "Grandma said you'd leave me." My chest tightened. "No," I said immediately. "Never." Sophie's voice was muffled against my shirt. "She said you leave when you're mad." I held her tighter. "Listen to me, Soph," I said. "If I ever leave a room, it's because I'm getting help, not because I'm leaving you." Sophie nodded, small, slow. Then she fell asleep against me like her body finally believed what her mind wanted to believe. The next morning, I didn't make a dramatic speech. I didn't post on social media. I didn't cry in the shower and call it healing. I did what I always do when something matters. I filed. Emergency order of protection. Documentation attached. Security camera footage attached. Audio attached. Witness list attached. 27 names. 27 people who couldn't pretend they didn't see. And when you're dealing with a family like the Harringtons, that's what breaks the spell. Not emotion. Evidence. Alex called once. His voice sounded like it came from a hallway. "Claire," he said. "Please. I don't know what's wrong with me." I believed him. That didn't excuse him. But it explained the haunted look I'd seen behind his eyes for years, like he'd been living someone else's life and couldn't find the exit. "Get help," I told him. "Real help. Not Kessler." "Can I see Sophie?" My throat tightened. "Not right now," I said. "Not until a court tells me it's safe." Silence. Then a small broken sound. "Okay." Then I ended the call. Because you can have compassion without offering yourself back as a sacrifice. A week later, Sophie asked me a question so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "Mom," she said, staring at her hands. "Am I bad?" My chest went tight. "No," I said instantly. "Why would you think that?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "Grandma said, if I love you more than Dad, I'm disloyal." Disloyal again. Always that word. It's a leash disguised as morality. I swallowed the kind of rage that makes you dizzy. Then I did the only thing that really breaks a lie. I told the truth. Gently, repeatedly, until it became her reality again. "Love isn't disloyal," I said. "Love is safe." Sophie blinked. "Safe?" she repeated, like she was trying the word on. "Yes," I said. "Safe means you don't have to earn it. You don't have to perform. You don't have to choose sides." Sophie's shoulders loosened. Just a little. Like a plant turning toward light. People ask me if I regret laughing. No, because that laugh wasn't joy. It was recognition. It was the moment I realized they didn't slap me to break me. They slapped me because they thought I'd never fight back. They were wrong. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of being called a liar, because the truth was already on the screen. Thanks for watching. If this story hooked you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? See you in the next video.